I can hardly believe that I have just finished my 5th conversation with Inma and Matthew. And this podcast series or each season has me in 5 conversations 5 times. So we are approaching the end. And luckily for me, Matthew and Inma are in my circle. They are kin. And I will continue to be having conversations with them separately, together, in other settings with other people. And for that, I am very, very grateful. But I have a feeling that you will soon be able to find both of them, either separately or together, in other settings, in other podcasts, going more visible, sharing their onlyness, to quote Nilofer Merchant. We speak about place and life. I think place is probably the center point of our meanders today, even though we both start and end with the gift culture. So have fun with us and stay tuned, because soon there will be a season 3 with 5 new conversation partners.
I've been listening our last podcast before 2 o'clock.
Mhm.
Very
Did you
nice.
finish it?
No, I couldn't, but halfway through, a bit more than half, 3/4 through,
Yeah.
and it reminded me of a story that I would like to tell you today.
Go ahead.
Please.
Yes, okay,
Yeah.
because it has to do with the gift
Mm.
that we were talking. When I was well, probably since I was 9 or 10 years old. Well, I'm not sure if you both or the audience know that in Spain there is a birthday that we celebrate and also a name day that we celebrate, right? My name day in Spain is the 8th of December, and it's a bank holiday in Spain, in the whole country. Even in South America, it's a bank holiday too. Um, it's the Virgin Mary. Hey.
Yes, the Inmaculada.
Yeah. So my grandma, since more or less I was 9 or 10 years old, um, gave me a gift um, for my name day, which was a box of chocolates bonbon. But I don't like chocolate, and she knows. She knew that I didn't like, and I don't like chocolate. So for years and years and years, I always got this gift from her, and it never occurred to me to ask her why, or even what the fuck. Sorry. you know, it never. I don't know. I think, or the feeling I got is that I was respectful with her wish that giving me this box of chocolate bonbons. And it wasn't something that she would do for the rest of my brothers and sisters. So it was something for me that it was special for her to do that. And and so it never occurred to me to ask her, why you do that to me? Why you give me something that I don't like? And you know that I don't like. But when I was 33 or 32, I wasn't living in Sanlúcar anymore, but she always got us together for the 8th of December to celebrate my name day. Um, so we were there big family, friends of family, husbands, children. So a big gathering that day. And she gave me the box of chocolate, a bonbon. And so I opened it. And for some reason that I'm not sure, I went and asked that year. I did ask her, um, and it was a beautiful answer. She said something like, "I do know that you don't like chocolates, but because you don't like chocolates, you are the only one who are going to open the box here and share it with everyone." And yesterday I was remembering, and today when I was listening the our last episode, I somehow it taught me about leadership, about relationship, and how a present, a gift, is not just for you. It's if you share, it's even more valuable. So I was remembering today when I was listening that the gift talking when we were in the part that we were talking about the gift economy and how spread is even when we don't see it that much uh, or recognize it that much. But with that presence, she for me, she did something. She did that she was putting people together with that present, with that gift, bringing people together and sharing uh, something that everyone valued, the bonbons, even though I didn't like them. But she was sure that doing that somehow was the only way for her to bring everyone together. And I wanted to share it with you.
It's a
Yeah,
beautiful story.
yeah, it is. And I've been thinking a lot about gifts and receiving as well. And I also listened to our episode 43.
Hmm.
Um, and really enjoyed it. And there's a lot. There's a lot to it.
Hmm.
One of the things that stands out to me on hearing that story, which is more of a broader reflection. It's not even necessarily about that
Wait,
story.
wait, wait.
Okay, my audio
You're
awful.
yeah, it's there's a click.
Yeah.
I've been hearing that from all of you, and it's really distracting. I was hoping you
Okay,
didn't
yeah.
hear
It
me.
sounds as if you're clicking a ballpoint pen.
I'm gonna leave Zoom and come back with earbuds and see if that fixes anything. My computer is telling me things that don't make sense, but it's empty. So
Okay.
back in a moment.
Okay.
Good.
Yeah, I saw it was you doing that with the click.
Yeah, and I thought it was someone, it's like who's making noise?
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. It is interesting this how sitting in a context where I know it's recorded, I pick up on other sounds in ways that I don't if it's not being recorded. So it's like there's a little extra layer of awareness that's just making sure that remember,
Yeah.
somebody else will be listening. It needs to be okay at least.
Yeah. Or yeah, because when I was last year, I was a period of time I was recording soundscapes. Um it's true that when you're recording, you're like paying more attention to the sounds that are there.
Mm.
It gives you another layer of awareness, even to use when you're not recording.
But had you been recording soundscapes before? Because I know you've been recording making your little movies, kind
Yes.
of the little Euroversion snippets.
Yeah. I have a lot of, but from 2 years back, from 2019 probably more, not before that, but from 2019, yes, I've been doing this recording. Yes, since
Now we are so curious.
Okay. So I'm curious, is my audio messed up?
No, now you
Okay.
don't sound as if you're clicking a ballpoint pen, as if you're absolutely just going crazy.
Let me tell you a story about. Yeah, that was a lot of fun to listen to.
Oh,
Um,
God.
well, what I was about to tell you was just a reflection about the gift culture within the culture as it stands, and how. So maybe this is true for you, Inma, with the story you just shared. Maybe not, but anyway, it brought it up for me. Is that Um, an interesting thing about gift culture is that it's already present within our culture,
Mhm,
but we're conscious, like I should speak for myself. What I perceive as real, more generally, is the market economy. Maybe that's because I need money to buy food. It might have something to do with it, um, that doesn't mean there's not also gift culture present throughout. And one of the really profound revelations for me has been coming to see that, like, where, it's the kind of thing where things can be present that are visible, but you have to adjust your vision to see them. You have to look in a certain way, right? And so I think it's like that with the gift economy or gift culture, where we're already participating in this. I mean, it's something that podcasters have talked about. It's something that people talk about in open source software contexts.
mhm.
Um, and it's not always about like a pure gift economy or something. There's often a hybrid sort of notion, but that there still is this presence of giving for the sake of giving, or for the sake of creating and developing social bonds. And it reminds me of what Dave Snowden said not too long ago about gift economy, which is that giving a gift is an indication that you want to be in community. And it's just an entirely different way of being in the world. It's I don't know how to. I mean, it's something entirely. It's like apples and oranges with the market economy, right? Because it's to the extent that there might be an exchange of gifts, it's not like it is in the market economy, because we don't keep score in the gift economy, because the purpose is not to keep score as it is in the market economy. The reason we have writing is to keep track of grain and transactions, right? Whereas in the gift culture, we give gifts to create social fabric ultimately, and then also um, that is when that social fabric is present, then it's a way to guarantee that abundance always flows in the direction of greatest need, that surplus always flows in the direction of greatest need, that people don't hoard wealth, because that doesn't make any sense in that worldview, mindset, culture, way of being. So, but I think that's powerful because, the thing with gift culture is often like, well, how am I supposed to participate in the gift economy? I have to buy food. I mean, I ask that question to myself. Um, and if I don't see that gift culture is already present, pervasive in society in some ways, then that question is a different question to ask and answer than if and when I do see how I'm already participating and even thriving from a gift culture perspective in a way that a market economy perspective makes my life look largely pathological or deficient.
I love the shift that you have done from calling it gift economy to call it gift culture, because that's something that has always bothered me somehow. They put them together in the same plane, in the same variable axis. Gift economy and market economy are not in the same axis. They are not something that we can measure the same way and say, okay, this is gift economy and this is market economy, because there's nothing to do with one with another one. So I like a lot that shift to the name of gift culture rather than gift economy. Yep. Thank
Which, together with what you said, Matthew, about writing being, actually to start with, it was this 15 sacks of grain and 12 sacks of whatnot, pork, meat, or, I don't know what. I was listening to the Emerald. I've started listening to the episode with the Australian Aboriginal, I don't remember his name,
Tyson
man.
Yokoporta.
That one, where I picked up on this big, big difference in what he shared there and what or how Robin Wall Kimmerer shares in Braiding Sweetgrass, where she says it's a deliberate action of hers to capitalize elder, sweetgrass, human, bear,
Mhm.
etc. in this way of honoring, and whatever his name was, Tucson?
Tyson Yokoporta.
Tyson saying, I am careful with naming. I don't want to name everything. And when I try to describe and put words to this feeling of the connection, for instance, boom, it's gone, because then I'm not in that state, that plane. And that is why I don't capitalize any of the words in my book. And I just went, ha, this is so
you.
interesting, because my sense is that they actually come from precisely, maybe not precisely, but they come from a viewpoint where they want to honor, treasure, cherish, be respectful.
Mhm.
And they kind of come to this opposite. One, I'm capitalizing it deliberately. One, I'm hesitant to even name it, but I definitely won't capitalize it, because the moment you capitalize it and say, here's wood,
Mhm.
you can easily put it into the market economy and
Right.
make it a commodity, and like
Mhm.
kind of lose the relationship with it. So I just, it was interesting to, I just, yeah, that gave me some Tankespjärn.
He's talking about something that I think he's talking about the same thing that Nora Bateson and maybe a couple others I've heard talk about emergence in those terms, in that this is not even a fear, it's just a recognition that, as emergence becomes a term that people use and people begin to grasp what we're pointing to when we use that word, then now we're going to find seminars on emergence in corporate settings, and we're going to wrap it up and package it and sell it for blah, blah, blah. And it's just going to be this same thing, just like what happened with systems in the 80s. And so,
Yeah.
um, and that is, I think, what he's and so actually that ties, that process is something that a number of people have also written about in the context of, um, well, broadly in the context of the history of our culture in the West, um, in particular around the time, the transition from oral to written culture. Um, and, and, David Abram talks about this in terms of the impact on what is animated to an oral culture versus a written culture. And in an oral culture, what is animated, what is animate is the world, and you as a part of it, not separate. And what is animated to a written culture is the words, the written word. And so, you read Harry Potter and a whole world opens up for you, right? And then we translate that into screens and video games and all that, right? And so we're always moving further away from what's actually living and supporting us. Um, but then also Ian McGilchrist talks about that same shift in terms of the hemispherical dominance of the brain, moving from a native right brain dominance, um, so that which is it's tricky, right? So I think there's something interesting here. I was thinking earlier in terms of market economy versus gift culture, or keeping them both as economies. That's like talking about matriarchy and patriarchy as though somehow we're just talking about a shift into which gender is dominating which, right? And that's what Rianne Eisler pointed to as, no, these are different apples and oranges. We have dominator and partnership. These are two different ways of being in the world. And it's the same thing with right brain dominance and left brain dominance. It's not that right brain left brain dominance is dominator culture, or it can be compared easily to dominator culture. There's a lot in common there. Right brain dominance is partnership between the two hemispheres. And because when the left brain is dominant, it disregards the right brain. When the right brain is dominant, it contains both opposites. It's a coincidence of opposites of both sides of the hemispheres, both sides of the brain that do things differently, and we need both of those ways of doing things. Because if the left brain is dominant, we never see the whole picture. And this is what happens in language. And to come back to what set me off on this point is that it's abstraction, right? And that's what Yokaporta says in that conversation too, is that when we name something, we're able to abstract it and then treat it as an object and dominate it and put it into a market economy. He doesn't go into saying all those things, but it's that same gist. And that if we, and he's speaking specifically in terms of capitalization, but he's also speaking specifically in terms of naming, in terms of proper naming, in this case with capital letters, but that it's about holding it loosely. And maybe this is also about coincidence of opposites, but that he's saying, like, you don't want it to get too rigid either. It's like he's got these five minds that he's connecting together, but he says, like, I sort of mess it up on purpose, because I say, like, I use the hand, 5 fingers, each finger represents this kind of mind, and you see those as separate, but don't forget the hand can become a fist and then they're all together. But you can also go, what does this one with that one and the other one look like, and put these fingers together and leave 2 of them out, and so that you can't, because this is where we get dogmatic thinking, and this is where we get scientism, as opposed to the rigorous practice of science, which is nothing is ever settled in science. And so when someone says, I am the science, they're demonstrating to people who understand what science actually is that they're either intentionally um, pulling the wool over people's eyes, or they're ignorant, right? And so, and I don't need to pass judgment on anyone, but the point is just that this rigidity is not where life is.
Mm. I was thinking in terms of both perspectives are totally complementary. I don't s- I see the no naming as the whole. Eh, See if I can put my thoughts here, because I'm gonna
We'll
link it
see.
also to God, so it's gonna be yes. So the no naming, right, alludes to the world, the whole world. But even when God created the world, every day he created a part of the world, and at the end of the day, she named that part, right? Because, as Matthew said, we have 2 parts of the brain, and both are really good at do the job they do. So, and when Kimmer says capitalize the name, what I feel is I am a woman and I'm Inma at the same time. I am a tree, and this January I've been, as you would know, drawing trees, and I was kind of obsessed with this, finding the names of the trees I'm drawing, right? And it wasn't because I needed them for me to pay attention to those trees, to find a relationship with the trees. I needed them to find a relationship with that tree particularly. So in my animated world, that those trees around me are all alive and are in relationship with me, and I am in relationship with them. With that particular tree that I wanted to draw, I was, what is her name? What is his name? So I think it's just that. It's just two part of the brain acting. One wants to be attending to the particular parts of that uniqueness, and the other part of the brain is wanting, desperate to attend to the whole.
Mm.
I I read those two people doing that somehow.
Well, and that is the coincidence of opposites that you're pointing to,
Yeah.
right? It's that these are two totally different ways of doing things. And we get caught in this from a left brain perspective, with left brain dominant perspective, we get caught in this notion that like one of them's right. And it's like, well, yes, and so is the other one,
Yeah.
right? And we need them both. Just like with, is it important to see the whole picture or the parts? Well, the answer is yes.
Yeah.
That's right.
Yeah.
And in that line, being emergence, uh, that beautiful world that implies that beautiful meaning and uh, world, or the world that wants to be, we need both. We need the people who is gonna make that meaning mainstream, and that will eventually vacuum clean somehow the whole part of the world. And we also need the because at some point when emergence get to the get to the moment when it's lost in meaning, when there is no meaning attached to it because it's too mainstream and people attach to it whatever they want, then it will come up, it will emerge another word that will go
Mm.
and complete the cycle and start again. So
Which he also points to,
mm,
this sort of transitional words.
mm,
And I'm thinking that's probably always there, right? It's like there will always be words that we need to use in a transition phase because there's always a transition phase.
mm.
It's like, yeah, there will be paradigm shifts, but then there'll be a new one and then a new one. And it can be worldview, it can be technology, it can be, it's like there's always something. Um, there's always something that's in that, old paradigm doesn't really work anymore. We're going towards the new one. How can we speak about this phase that we're in? It's like, yeah, transitional words. Um,
I think too about the notion of the finger pointing at the moon, and in terms of words and naming like that, and in terms of transitional words even, in that it's um, the finger pointing at the moon is doing so to allow us to see the moon. Relying on the finger is not it's a crutch, right? And so it's sometimes and s- a crutch. So maybe a crutch is the wrong term. That's what people use that word, but that um it gives you a leg up or a head start, or it's it offers assistance in seeing the moon. It's like a teacher does to for a student. But the goal of a teacher teaching a student is not to make the student reliant on the teacher, but rather the other way around. For I mean, hopefully, the purpose of a teacher is to enable the student to move beyond the teacher, to discover things the teacher will never be able to discover, but also just to be able to thrive in whatever context the teaching is about. And so these words can um, we can talk about emergence and be looking at the same thing, and 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 therefore the word allows us to just sort of home in on and verify that, yeah, like, oh, emergence. Well, so I sort of generally know what you mean about that, and as we talk about it, we can get a greater sense of, yes, we're looking at the same thing, and we each have a perspective on it, but what we're looking at is something that's actually real and alive. It is not the word. Right, and that's it's that way of being in relationship with what it is we're looking at, that is not about the word, and that when we package the word and we say like, "Oh, now I like
Got
emergence
it.
is a solid fixed target, and I've identified it, and now I can wrap it in a box and sell it on LinkedIn or something." Rather than emergence is a living thing to be in relationship with. Those are two entirely different ways of being in the world, and one of them I wanna say something provocative, like one of them has a future, you know? But on a certain level, I don't know if that's even provocative other than just, like, telling it like it is or something. But I think that's a really crucial distinction to be able to make.
And I've been thinking I'm gonna see if I can find a um file because I I read let's see, I will put here. I read um Colin Wilson's C.G. Young book,
Hmm.
little book. Um and in Swedish. But so there were plenty. There were like 20, 15, 20 pieces that I've written down. And one of them, because it's like, I under, I've heard Steve Emery speak about active imagination. Dominic there's a lot of archetypes. Clarissa Pinkola Estes at Women Who Run with the Wolves. It's a Jungian analyst. And, it's like, so, but I've never really I don't know, Jung. I don't have a clue. So it was really a good thing to read this little book. But one of the things on page 104 in my book, I'll try to translate it. So it says, what he'd been searching for in Africa was the feeling that there's an invisible world around us. Primitive people feel that they are surrounded by spirits. In Europe, the poltergeist activity is viewed as an inexplainable expression for the unconscious. In Africa, it is viewed as a visible expression of um, the spirits that can't be seen. Yeah, the spirits that are there but aren't visible and tangible. Um, which I think also is this thing about animating it's like there's in a left brain dominated world, if I can't see it, measure it, explain it, doesn't exist. um Whereas in that partnership, it's like, yeah, I can't see it. Doesn't mean it's not real. No, it's just something else. And again, it's interesting how there's so much that is not tangible that in the culture that we live in is absolutely accepted. Love. How do you measure that? Where does it sit? It's like it's there. It's like nobody says love doesn't exist. Or I haven't heard anybody say it, right? It's like, but where do you find that? So some little remnants remain, at least, of these where we are culturally okay with the stuff that we just cannot explain in a left brain dominant rational, logical, point one leads to two, leads to three, and that way. It's like, yeah, try to explain love that way. I'm sure there's been lots of neuroscientific testing to try to figure out where in the brain love is. And somewhere I read or heard somebody saying that, you know, in maybe it was in the introduction to the Master and His Emissary, actually, about neural scans. It's like it's spoken about as if, okay, when you're angry, this part of the brain lights up. But that's just a matter of scale, you know. It's mostly there. That's where there's the most activity. There's activity in the entire brain,
in
right?
the
It's
entire
like
body.
yeah,
Well, yeah,
precisely.
right.
Everywhere there's activity, precisely. But it's like, but if we kind of turn that down so that we only see the peaks, then it looks as if it's situated here. Hmm. Or maybe not.
Well,
You
and it's
know?
interesting because we think about we think of the brain as something contained within the skull, and
Yeah.
that there is that thing there, yes, and there's a term that's being used now, which is the skull brain,
Yeah.
to by its use point out
Mm.
that the brain is not contained. I mean, because we talk about neurology. Like, I fall for this, like neurology, neuroscience, it's all inside the cranium.
Right.
Like, that's what
Right.
that's studying. What does NEUR mean, though? Right? Nerve. The nervous system is not contained within the skull,
No.
and the nervous system is distributed through the entire body. And so, what is the brain really? And it's even then again, like, particularly from a left brain perspective, the brain is a part, and it's like it does everything. It's in the driver's seat, or it's making the decisions, or what whatever. Maybe it's doing what the body's telling it to do. I mean, in terms of the
Yeah.
the traffic of information in the nervous system, 80% of that traffic is afferent, meaning it goes from the body to the brain. 20% goes in the other direction. So who's telling who to do what, actually, right? Like, there's all this sensory input that is, we don't anyway, you know what I'm saying? It's just one of these things that's hidden in plain sight if we're not really conscious about what words we're using and what they mean.
Yeah. And I've only read the introduction to the Master and His Emissary in like 16 pages of the first chapter or so. But in it, he points also to this. I mean, it's kind of fun. He's kind of wordy, and having the book feels like he looks. Here's this older British gentleman, who quite likes his words, and he'll go, on little. So it's like it feels as if it's a conversation. I'm in a conversation with him. He's telling me something, but he has this little example of music showing precisely this partnership between left brain, right brain, or left hemisphere, right hemisphere, which had me thinking of Benjamin Sanders, the TED talk he gave where he speaks about classical music and how it's he shows he has a big grand piano on stage and he's showing this and he's like when you start to play music, piano, it's like one finger here and one finger there. You're like trying to work it out. And then you get a little bit, okay, you're doing the scales, but it's still this very mechanistic way of doing it. And you find you get to be able to play a fugue by Bach or something, but it's still this very rigid, left brain dominated way of like, here's the detail, and this is the note, and it's a half note or it's an eighth, it's like it needs to be done. And then eventually you come into what he explains as one buttock playing, where you're on one of your butt cheeks and you're playing. And that is for me when you kind of step out of the detail into that hole where you know the notes, you know the value of each note, you know where they're situated, but you're in the music somehow. Um it looks as if you guys haven't watched that TED Talk.
That I've heard of one buttock playing before, so I may have, but it's been a long time ago.
I haven't, but I would love to get
I'm
a little
gonna
bit
I'm
deeper,
Yeah,
into
I'll
this.
send you a link and I'll put it in the show notes because it's
Because
just a favorite of mine.
sorry,
Done.
what if it's the opposite way around?
Well, how?
Say more.
Why do you have to start knowing the notes?
Mm.
So I'm not gonna try to explain it. It's just, he has been a piano teacher, a music teacher, conductor, whatever.
Yeah.
This was his way of showing how it is. But somehow I think also starting in the right brain partnership way, where why would you want to play music? Why would you want to play the piano? It's not because of the here's a note and here's a note value. It's like, right? So Ian McGilchrist speaks about how it flows between the right brain and the left brain. And for me, that's what it feels like. Benjamin Sanders explains also. It's like
Mm,
this flow in between how you both of them are there, both of
yes.
them are in play. Neither of them is more important than the other. You need both. It is the partnership. It is this. That's where.
Yes, yes, and what I'm trying to say is your the interest you when you me. Okay, I'm gonna speak. I wanting to go to music is not my willing to music is music itself. It's not the left part of the brain wanting to
Mhm,
know
mhm.
the how music is made. Then one that connection is made, and that connection is made, I believe, when we are very, very, very even inside the room,
Yeah,
right?
heartbeats. Yeah,
Yeah. When that connection is made, then there would be a moment of, actually, I want to know what this how can I apprehend this knowledge? How can I make this happening Bach or Beethoven? Or how can I tap into the creative part of the knowledge of the creative part? But if I don't have that interest at the beginning, which is coming from the whole, I don't think I would be very interested in going to the process of learning the music, learning how to play
yeah,
the piano, for
yeah.
example.
I'm totally with you. And it's like for me that is what he speaks to. It is like
Yeah.
it starts in that there's something here.
Mm.
It's like that just is. And I love what it is. And then some people are forced, you have to play the piano or the guitar or the flute or whatever, which kind of totally get some people just say, "No, I won't ever," and some people find that there's something here where if I have gotten this somehow knowledge, something else can emerge.
Mhm.
And it's like, well, it's interesting. Music is interesting that way. Because I mean, I think that we can make a lot of music without having the knowledge of what's this tone, what's this tempo, what's this, you know?
Yeah.
And there's also there's a lot of music that somebody has made that I would like to know that how can I do that?
Yeah.
Which brings me over to my neighbor over here, works at Skånes Dansteater. Yeah, the dancing theater here in Skåne, which is a lovely place, modern dance. And I was asking her, what does the sheet music of modern dance look like? A piece of here's this piece. They put up shows and it's called a name and there's, three acts and you're supposed to come in from the right then and twirl here but how do you like put that down? Cuz it's like words, yeah, we have the alphabet. Music, yeah, we have the musical alphabet. It's dance, how does that look? And she explained to me that if you work, if you work with a choreographer, you help them set up their work, then you might learn their work in such a way that you can then set it up. But I, who've never worked with any choreographer, would not be able to take, oh, that show you did 10 years ago by that choreographer, whatever, because it doesn't exist. Now maybe you can because it's, on TV or something, it's been filmed, but so
Yeah.
there's like that feels somehow more um ephemeral. It doesn't turn into something as tangible as a word does to me or as sheet music does to me. It's like I can take sheet music, I can give it to Matthew and he'll play it, you know, and then give it to somebody else who has no clue and they'll just go, "What?" But they know it's sheet music, so they'll find somebody, right? But choreography or modern dance or ballet, I'm guessing ballet is the same, but maybe there's more names to the classical ballet poses. But modern dancing, where you're like contorting, how do you like? What's the name of that movement that you just made?
It's interesting is that it brings up a lot of things, but a couple, just one to in passing is Christopher Alexander's pattern language, which began in the context of architecture. He was an architect, and the original book was written by a team or a collective of architects, um, describing a pattern language of architecture, which is to say, these are patterns that exist within architecture, and you can almost take them and just like pick out the ones you need. But it's also about relationship with place and all these other things. But that just in passing. Anyway, what I'm hearing in a lot of this though is whether we're talking about music or dance, and it kind of comes together for me in what you're describing with dance is oral versus written culture, right? Because musical notation is the written form of, it's
Yes.
written, and these are abstract. It's fully abstract. There's nothing in where the D is on the scale. I mean, there is, I could say, I guess you could say there's a chronology, a linear chronology to placement that corresponds with the keys on a piano, which correspond with the notes in a scale. But even that scale is tempered, right? That like the
Yep.
Western scale is mathematically contrived for the sake of using machine-like instruments to reproduce sound that we call music, right? That's very different from a bone flute, right? It's an entirely where you might have a diatonic scale or a pentatonic scale or something where these are things that exist in the world and we can ascribe geometric features to them and so forth and so on. But that gets very quickly into the abstract with geometry even. And so, um, but then, and so, because you can have, there are people who can play music but can't read music, and they can play Bach, but they still can't read music because they can hear it and play it. They know how to do that. There are people that can do both. And there are, in terms of where Emma was going this originally, there's this sense of the process of coming to music and learning music and teaching or learning music. And the way that's done in our culture in the West is generally speaking, broadly done as a feature of written culture. Right. And this is, and we're, I learned to play the piano. I learned to play the guitar first, but really got traction with the piano, and it's a machine, right? It's a percussion machine, basically. And I still love it, but it's within this particular context that's very different from djembe or something like I'm thinking of these sort of archetypal instruments like drums and flutes, or where it's either like here's here's a resonant chamber with a skin. I hit it and I can create a rhythm, or here's a hollow tube with holes in it that I can blow through with my breath and create melody. Which of course is just we're just recreating the human body there, because that's all that the human
Exactly.
body, when we're singing, it's just breath, it's air moving through a resonant chamber, right? And so, um, in terms of dance, you get to this thing with choreography where, and I've never known much about this. I have a friend actually who's has a history in dance and choreography, and I've never talked about this with her. Um, but that's where I was thinking about a pattern language, because when you're working with a particular choreographer, studying under Martha Graham, or stuttering, easy for me to say, studying under Merce Cunningham or whoever, that you're learning their language of dance. And you can only learn it in relationship with them and with their work, right? And so then that can inform your work and you take it out into the world. But I can learn from Bach if I can read music. And that's not the same thing, right? Because one of those is an example of a written culture and how a written culture works, and the other is an oral culture. And in terms of living in a living world or not, this is what David Abram points to in terms of language, and how when we went from Hebrew to Greek, we lost all reference within the written symbols of representation or symbol, because that is present in the Hebrew alphabet. Aleph, Bet, these different letters they're originally pictures. They're originally something not unlike a pictograph or a hieroglyph. I think there's a particular name for it, but and that's present within the Hebrew alphabet because of the Hebrew culture. But when the Greeks take the Hebrew alphabet and they make it into their own, all those references are immediately gone. And so now we have a purely abstract series of symbols or signs or whatever the proper term is, that we use to construct these linear sentences and all that. But when we go further back to, like, that representation within the Hebrew alphabet is a vestige of oral culture. So that when we're in an oral culture, where do we turn for knowledge in a written culture? Well, we open a book, right? Generally speaking, or we go online
Today
and
you'd
read
Google.
something.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. But it's words. It's letters into
Yeah,
words into
it
sentences,
is.
right? Whereas in an oral culture, that's not a part of the landscape. And so how do we know what something is? How do we know what something's name is? Abram describes a conversation that is ongoing and always changing, right? Between the people and the landscape and the more than human elements of the landscape, the trees, the rocks, the animals. And how do you find out what their names are? Well, on a certain level, what you're actually doing is asking them. And also when we have names, we have Um, now I'm forgetting who it is that talks about this. I think it's Abram in The Spell of the Sensuous, but um, n- names for places are descriptive. Names for people are descriptive, maybe metaphorical, but descriptive. And so we don't have a name like a name for a concept, like Inma, your birth name is, right? Or I'm sure my name, Matthew, has a meaning originally, but it wasn't the meaning that was why it was given to me. It was this association with a character in a religious book, right? And so there's a remove there. It's not, they don't call me, he was born 3 days after an eclipse. That would be descriptive and accurate. They give me a name that has nothing to it has to do with me only through some idea in my parents' perception of me and my place in the world or I don't know what their thinking was, but so this is a totally different way of being in relationship with naming. And that seems, at least in an oral context, like it's less of a concern that we're gonna fall into the question of capitalization or what we're trying to avoid by not capitalizing something. That this rigidification is something that happens in a literal landscape and not an oral landscape.
Yeah, which brings relationship to the center. I mean, I can participate in a composition, a dance composition, always that I could be in relationship with the choreographer, and the people who are dancing. If I'm not, I won't be able to do that. And cutting through my relationship with the sound, putting words or notes down on the paper so I can understand them from my left hemisphere. So dancing, we haven't got that far. Dancing is still more, is wilder
Yeah.
than
Yeah.
music
It's
in that
not
sense.
as domesticated.
Exactly.
Yeah, it's more feral.
We try with classical dancing.
Yeah.
There's something about place in this too because of memory. Right, because when you're talking about notation with music, like, why do we write anything down? So we can it helps us remember it. We don't it's not actually that's actually not true. It doesn't help us remember it. It helps us forget it,
Precisely,
right?
precisely.
It
So that
allows
I
us
don't
not
have to
we
remember.
don't have to remember it, right? And so, so then it's external to me. I'm not living in relationship with it anymore. I can literally put it on a shelf.
Mhm.
And but Abram talks about a tradition in, I'm not gonna try and name the tribe because I'm probably gonna get it wrong, but it's a Native American tribe in, the Southwest of the US, with a feature of the culture where there are stories that are tied to specific places that are used as, um, I don't know, I don't know how to describe what they're doing. They're ways of I don't want because I don't want to say corrective. Maybe that's appropriate, but they're ways of defining the culture um, by identifying its boundaries of behavior. So that when and Yoko Porta talks about this, I think, in the conversation you're referring to, Helena, on the Emerald, that there are um, there are things that a culture is and that a culture is not. There are things that are appropriate to a culture and that are inappropriate, right? And so we need to have a living awareness within a culture of what those things are. And in an oral culture, in this example, he's talking about how the practice is um, there are these stories that are related to place, and each of the stories is an identification of a boundary line through a story where someone crossed the boundary and something bad happened to them or something bad happened to their family or there was a negative consequence for this behavior because They stepped beyond the bounds of what's culturally appropriate. And it's tied to a place because that happened in this place. That makes it real. It's not even that that makes it real. It is real. And so they're describing the place where it did happen. And then he describes a process where when an elder witnesses a younger member of the culture moving in that same direction of that going beyond that boundary of the culture, they have this subtle but profound process where they'll, in that person's presence in front of others, they'll make reference to that story. And I generally, what will happen then if it works is that the person will like just kind of excuse themselves and leave, or like they'll get the message, but it's done in a sense. There's a way where there's a subtlety of like not shaming, and they're not saying like, "Hey, you did something wrong," but they're saying something that they know which pair of ears it will land in because that's the pair of ears that need to hear it because there's an awareness that you're on that edge, and and in that way, then every time they drive past that place, because these are actual places in the landscape they share, they drive past that place, or a friend tells them that they went past this place that they know is right next door to that place. That same story and that same um, comment from the elder comes back to them. And so that the culture, the awareness of that boundary of the culture is alive within them through relationship with that specific place. And it's a place that has a name like, you know, where the creek runs over the Great White Boulder or whatever. I'm making this up, but it's a descriptive term for a place that is real, right? It's not, it's not a conceptual name. Um, and it seems like I had another component for another comment about the written culture component for that. And I don't remember what it was, but I think that, well, it's just to do with memory, right? That when we start writing things down, we have an entirely different relationship with memory that's not based on place. Like he does point to how we have a vestige of this in Western culture, which shows up on BBC versions of Sherlock Holmes, that the memory palace idea, right? Is that this is something that comes from Roman orators who would memorize their speeches by walking through this. They're walking in a building, but they're walking through and they're remembering where they are along the way. But that this is the way human memory works. It's spatial. It's relative to space and to place. And that as we move away from, of course, why were the orators doing this? Because they weren't writing their speeches down, right? They were remembering them for oral reproduction. And so I think there's a lot in that in terms of, because there's a lot that comes together there in terms of oral versus written, living in an animate versus an inanimate world, a real versus an abstract experience of the world of places, and this component of place, which, I mean, in conversations that you and I have had, Inma, in the past, we've talked about, or I've articulated it this way, that culture is what arises in relationship between a people and a place. And that originally, anyhow. And so I think that place is endemic to human culture, but that we've gotten away from that. We've lost sight of, we lost our relationship with that awareness as we had, because all of us are, we're born into a literal culture. And so there may still be vestiges, but we have to do some work of uncovering where we come from in those terms.
And it's interesting. I'm linking it to like the Bible or the Quran, or which is these written stories coming from a place where certain things made sense that are now like, it's like they've levitated away from place and are valid in throughout the world. If you're a Christian in Sweden or the US or Africa or India, it's like you live by the same rule. Um which means that some of those rules doesn't make sense at all. There's nothing that makes sense to that if you live in a cold country, because it's from a warm country where, temperatures are 40 degrees Celsius. Um, which means that meat go bad really quickly. It's like, so that we then stay with the rules without
Making sense.
linking them, without making them relevant to this place.
Like, yeah.
What would it be like here? Yeah, I get Ayurveda, India, warm country, monsoon, moisture, lots of weird bugs for me, because I'm not Indian. Transplanting that to Sweden, it's not a like for like exchange. So kind of, and I think the fact that it is written down makes it harder. If it had been oral, it would have grown, it would have shifted as you moved away from the warm country to the cold country. It would just not make sense, so it would shift. So that emergence would probably be more vital or, happening,
Natural.
active. Yes, it would be an aspect of it in a way, which, one of my favorite On Being episodes, I probably have 100 favorite On Being episodes, but this is one of them with, Rabbi Lau Levi, I think his name is, God Optional, Creative, everybody welcome. He's a rabbi in New York. He speaks about the Bible this way, the Old Testament. And I just love it because because he just says, that doesn't make any sense at all. That was really valid 3,000 years ago. Today, nah, don't go there. And it's just, it's liberating to hear somebody who is still steeped in the tradition, still steeped in, he is a rabbi. He is a Jew. That is his culture. That is what his beliefs are. And he's allowing, like, roots to form in the here and now somehow, uh, rather than it just being this fluffy thing that lost its roots 2,000 years ago.
That the other thing about the the transition from Hebrew to Greek with the alphabet is that in Hebrew there are no vowels. And in Greek, what the Greeks did was they took these, what were to them extra letters in the Hebrew alphabet, and made them into vowels. So they fixed something. And I say fixed because in Hebrew, in the Hebrew Bible, there is a built-in component of ambiguity that, because there are no vowels written, but there are a multiplicity of vowels in the language, different words can be pronounced differently and create different meanings. And so there is no way, it's like a security against rigidification that's inherent in that, right? And so, and so related to that, I have no idea what the causality is, but related to that is, or that exists within as a part of a culture that has, in my understanding, all along maintained a relational relationship. That's redundant, but that their relationship with the written word is not fixed, and that there is a arguing with the text, even arguing with God. Israel means, he who wrestles God, literally, right? So that that's actually endemic to the culture. That's not at all it's far from taboo. It's actually central. And so the effect that has is that while there is this written text, the meaning is not fixed, because every person who reads it, every new generation, you cannot escape making the need to make your own meaning of the text. Whereas when we get, the New Testament was originally written in Greek, right? So
Yes.
everything's already fixed right there. And so then we can have we've at that point we have cut the finger pointing at the moon off of the hand, and now we're just going to carry it with us wherever we go and call it truth. And well, to say that's missing the point, which is to see the moon, so. But what's interesting about that, in particular to me, with the Hebrew vowels, is that what is that but breath, right? That's and I think, and I'm going further than I probably should, but and I think all of this is really coming from David Abram in terms of what I just shared, but that um, ruach is a Hebrew word which means both um, breath and wind. And so, okay, there are all these words in English, Greek, Hebrew, like they're in Latin, animal, animate, spirit, right? All these, psyche, even all these go back to wind or to air or to breath in their original meanings. But that it is that living, like what is, how do we know if somebody's breathing? Like, put your hand in front of their mouth. How do you know if they're alive, right? So that breath is a definition of life on a certain level, and that the text itself requires human breath to be alive, right?
Right.
That so we're not. It's not separate from us. Like it's literal, but it's not gone across that final line that we get with Greek, where everything is finally solidified, and what breath you bring to it is already indicated by the text itself, as opposed to it's taking your agency in terms of meaning making away before you even come in the door. Before you're even born, it's already gone. Whereas with Hebrew, you can't get away from that.
That that reminds me of it could be defined, I guess, as a slogan of someone that you both know that says, "People like us do things like us, like this." And I think simplifying culture to that is kind of saying we don't need place, and place equal nature here. We just need people. So human people are the one that are the culture. And the differences between the different culture is people like us do things like this. And then you don't need place, you don't need nature, you don't need anything else. Interesting.
Well, it brings up, we're going to sound like emerald junkies today, maybe because we are, but there's another episode that I've been listening to from that show. Um, I can't remember what it's called, but it's tra is the first word, which is a root. It's a Proto-Indo-European root. Um, I'm very curious about his sources, because he connects a lot of words as having the same root that I haven't been able to find in my meager etymological resources online. I'm not doubting him, but it makes me curious. Truck, train, travel, transportation, mantra, trip, like all of these word thread, all of these are coming from this traverse. Anything in Latin from TRA is coming from
Translation.
translation, transit, anything with trans is, um, but tra and trance, of course, too, and entrance, which is also in trance, right? But he's talking about a lot of things, of course, because you're looking at a root that's that fundamental and also fans out that broadly throughout languages. You're talking about a lot of different things, but that one of the things that he says in there is that he's talking about trains and how many train songs there are. Isn't it amazing? Like trains just evoke something for people. And they were very controversial when they came. People were of two minds about what impact they would have on the culture. But that one of the things he points to is how with this ability to travel that fast, we then move from a pilgrimage of traveling to a place for a purpose to going anywhere.
Mm.
And so that, we could go to Athens and eat at McDonald's, right? And so the geography of nowhere is a term from, I want to say the 80s even, that I was first seeing that. But a long time ago, this notion of like strip malls and franchises on, and, but that he's talking about anywhere as opposed to nowhere, actually, which is, I think, an interesting distinction. Maybe they're synonymous, but I like this somewhere versus anywhere, because he's not saying going nowhere. He's saying we're going, but we could go anywhere, which is on a certain level equatable, right? That, but that this, culture and the role that place plays in culture is what is what's coming up for me with what you're saying, Emma. And
Yeah.
of course, I agree with you about that. But I think it's interesting in terms of, well, we use different directions to go with that, in terms of the notion of trance and how we are entranced by, so much, but we're not entranced with purpose. Like in a culture, in an oral culture, in relationship with a place, trance served a very particular purpose, and it had a particular role in the culture. Whereas, where it's true today too, but what is that role? Like what World of Warcraft? Like what is the purpose? Right? Meta, virtual reality. What is the purpose? I
Mm.
say meta TM, like Mark Zuckerberg's new fantasy. That like, I know that here's how we'll solve all the problems. Everybody just, if you're not tuned out enough already, here's a way to tune out more. And now things will get better. And of course they will for Mark Zuckerberg, but it's like that's moving further away from any sense of being grounded in reality, in a living world, even in the place of the building you're in, the room you're in, which is already an anthropocentric zone,
Yeah. Yeah.
but let's go further away from that.
Mm.
Sorry, that's not very solution oriented, but just the role of place is really what I wanted to
Yeah.
point to that.
And I love train.
Me too.
And compared to planes,
Hmm?
but in compared with my feet, I love my feet better.
Yeah.
Well, one of the interesting things he points to about trains is the rhythm, which is also a part of song. Like, Arlo Guthrie singing Steve Goodman's The City of New Orleans, which is the name of a train in the US. The rhythm of the rails is all they feel, right? That they're it's a hypnotic, it's like
Yeah.
drumming at a circle. It's like that
Yeah.
theta beat for trance induction, right? I mean,
And it
so
is disappearing. I mean, there
Mhm.
are more
Yeah.
and more train tracks where that little gap isn't there because they worked out somehow how to avoid solar warped tracks.
Mhm.
I don't know how that works, but so even today, at least in Sweden, you can go on a train and that sound isn't there.
Mm. What a pity.
So what's interesting to me about that is
Wait.
I don't know who, I've been listening to so many different people talking about so many amazing things that they did blurs, right? But somebody I was listening to was talking about, this might have been Tyson U. Comporto on a different podcast even, but that, the notion of the animate versus the inanimate world. I think it was David Abram that, we can, you could go for a walk in the park and there are living things. You can have bare feet on grass. There are trees, there are birds, there are rabbits. But if you're in Times Square, that's a greater challenge. And maybe this is why some people are so inclined, like people like us do things like this. People define culture because if you're in Times Square, the only living thing, the most prominent living thing, and it is people. Of course, there are also bacteria and weeds
Invisible
and
world. Yeah.
birds, right? And but it's harder. It's not like if there's a tree, it was planted, and so there's not much of that there. So in an anthropocentric context, it's more difficult to see the animate nature of the living world. And I'm including when I'm talking about the more than human world, I'm not just referring to quote unquote living things, fungi, bacteria, plants, and animals. I'm talking about rocks. I'm talking about streams. I'm talking about places. And so he's saying, what about that? It, that's still present in those things, right? They're very highly processed, but this is why this culture digs big holes in the ground is to get iron out and to get these different things out to then process into these tall buildings and everything else. And but there's this notion that you can still that livingness is still present. It's muted often or obscured or harder to see because it's made into something else, but it doesn't mean it's not present. And so you can still find that if you look for it. And when you're Helena, the way you're talking about that click clack of the rails disappearing, I realize like that sound is an example of that livingness. That the steel rails they're highly processed, but they're also elemental. And that's
Mm.
actually maybe more, or less processed, given that this is a technology that originates in the 1800s, or there, I mean, I guess it was the 1800s that um, we didn't have such sophisticated technologies of industry at that time that we do now, where we have fiber optic cable and microchips and this, that, and the other. But and so maybe it's not as obscure in the train tracks, and so we can actually still hear that. And this sophistication of technology that's available to us now is what's erasing that, and it's making it harder then to like so that sound is the presence of the living world in
Yeah.
its elemental form in that technology.
And I'm just putting words to something that I've been doing and kind of had in me for, I don't know, forever. But you saying that Times Square, it's there are rocks. They're just highly processed. It's like highly processed food. I'm not even sure it should be called food, but highly processed food doesn't really nourish me. It's not good for me or for you or for the planet. It's like there's a reason why I love having wool and cotton and leather shoes and like I live in an old house, 100 years old, where I don't want to paint the walls with plastic paint. The kitchen. I mean, and I think that this is kind of part of the problem is that we are the highly processed world puts us in this hazy place. It's like a fog that is enveloping all of us. And we can't see, we can't feel, we're not nourished. We're not grounded. Um so all of the talk about highly processed food is like, ooh, can we like broaden that too? Can more stuff be not highly processed? Um, I mean, those like gym clothes that are made out of, I don't know, everything weird that it's in them. It's like I have a hard time just taking pieces of clothes like that from the washer and hanging it up because I don't. It doesn't nourish me. It doesn't feel good to me to touch it even.
Mm. Yeah, that goes back to 80% of our brain is in the body or is in the whole, and the skin is the majority of it.
Yeah, it's huge.
It's huge. So we are processing soon, if not already, we are highly processing people.
Yes.
Processed. We are highly
Hi,
processed people.
people. Yeah.
And then we don't mind. Sorry, Elena. We won't mind to eat highly processed
Food.
meat, which is made in a laboratory.
Yes.
But that better, or much better that than have a relationship with a cow.
Yeah.
The laboratory is much better.
Yeah. Which is weird.
I think
Eh,
the degree to which we can consume processed food, which that feels compatible to us, is a measure of how of how we're in relationship with place or land or not,
Yeah.
or the
Yeah.
living world.
Yeah. Yeah. Definitely food and place. It's this.
Yeah. Yeah. So interesting. It's just because we are highly processed people. I mean, there's these anti-inflammatory molecules that are in our bloods. It's like you measure a kid at birth and they have like 123 chemicals in them
And
just
plastic.
it's not supposed to be there. It's just not supposed to be there. It's like, shit, we're messing with ourselves and everything else
Yes.
by doing this.
So, so this is provocative, but it's I think useful.
Please.
Two
Provoke.
angles on that, because I'm wanting to I'm working with this notion of hope without optimism, that it doesn't this looking around, there's very little reason for optimism, and so it's probably not useful to be optimistic, but I feel it's a responsibility to be hopeful, because if I'm not hopeful, I'm just saying, like, forget it, like I'm throwing in the towel. So I see what you're saying, of course. I mean, I see that too in the world. And it brings up two things. One is from Tyson Yunkaporta, and the other is from Terence McKenna. And I feel like I should apologize to
They
Tyson
are not
Yunkaporta
provocative
for
people, and they.
well, right. Terence McKenna is a very different flavor of provocative and
Yeah.
often quite obnoxious in my experience. So I should qualify placing them next to each other. But but this is something that McKenna said that was useful. But Yunkaporta is saying in one of his appearances on the Emerald, I think the first one chronologically, where they're talking about his book Sand Talk, and he's talking about patterns and talking about how there is the pattern, and the pattern is necessary. It's how we survive. It's how the world continues. But also necessary is the disruption of the pattern,
Yeah.
because it's essentially like, you can think of it as stress testing or just keeping balance. A living, self-organized system has to hover near the edge of chaos between equilibrium and disequilibrium, because if equilibrium is achieved, that's what we call death, right? So there has to be both. And so if we look at a broad time scale, then what we're doing is disrupting the pattern. And in that sense, it's necessary. In that sense, we don't have to see it as pathological. I'm always looking for a way of seeing things without pathologizing them. And this is a particularly difficult one to do that with.
Mhm.
But so there's that. And then We could also talk about dandelions. What dandelions do are similar roots with tapweeds that are the, people who garden often hate these things. They're just like, it's always, never mind the fact that it's really powerful medicine. And there's a whole other more holistic way of being in relationship with those things. But what, or burdock, there's a whole bunch of plants that do this, particularly these ones with strong tap roots, because what are they doing? There's a stratification to the soil, right? And the humus is on top. All this decaying living matter. There's all the nutrients in there, but there are minerals deeper down that are also necessary. But you can't just go in and till it. Oh, well, you can. But if you do go in and just keep tilling it, then the living part, you keep disrupting that, and you're killing that community before it ever is established. And you're bringing the minerals up to the surface. And that's not actually a sustainable kind of soil. That's not a living soil. But so what a dandelion or a burdock root does is it reaches down, penetrates that, even like thick, hard clay, and transports those minerals up to the surface where they can blend in with the decaying living matter, right? And so then and that's contributing to a sustainable living soil ecosystem. And um, again, on a broad time scale, that makes me think about mining, right? And I'm not saying that as an apologist for mining. It's a gruesome, it's hard, like I said, it's hard to find a view of that that doesn't pathologize it. But what McKenna said, to maybe tie these things together and consider a whole list in terms of really living in an inanimate world, because if we take that to its logical extension, or to its logical conclusion, then if the Earth is living,
I know
then
where
so
you're
is the
going.
sun. You've heard this before. So is Jupiter. So right, and so the McKenna asked a question that I have been asking outside of this in that context and also outside of it ever since, because I think it's very useful. What is the ecological function of human beings? Because if we are part of nature, if Gaia is a living organism, we can't get off so easily as just pathologizing human behavior, because humans are just any more than we can, what liver cells are doing, and so humans have a purpose. And he actually says in this conversation, it's not that our purpose is, we're not glorified for having a purpose. Liver enzymes have a purpose. That doesn't mean that we should stop the show and put them on the marquee, like in the same way that we shouldn't do that for humans. But it also doesn't mean that we are pathological interactions. So what on earth is that purpose? And he takes this, and we don't have to follow him on this route, but as an example, if Earth is an organism, how do we identify a living organism? It's something that reproduces, right? And so let's talk about going to Mars. Let's talk about going to the moon. Let's talk about space travel. Let's talk about the bacteria that went to the moon and back and survived. Like, let's talk about the space probes we've sent out that have now actually left the solar system, how we define the solar system, and are carrying, no matter how hard we tried, we got to know that it's carrying life forms out there into space. So what are those but seeds, right? There's even a theory, I think it was one of the DNA guys, Crick or Watson, that had a theory about this in terms of how life originated on this planet. It was seeded from a meteor or something like that. And I'm not buying into all these theories, but just for the sake of playing with the frame, what is the purpose of humans? What is the ecological function of human beings as a way of understanding how we're performing a pattern disruption? And not even that I'm not in that saying like, so let's get on board with Elon Musk. I'm
I was gonna
not
say that.
like I am not on his side, that's to me, like, that is an expression of insanity, ungrounded insanity. The notion that our solution lives on Mars, humans didn't evolve to live in that atmosphere. They evolved to live in this atmosphere. Y'all have a nice trip, but I'm staying here. Like, sorry, I'm staying on the station. And so anyway, I've said enough.
But pattern disruption, it's interesting to link that to what we were speaking about with oral or written and place and like rules or the boundaries of this culture and not that culture, that when we lose the connection to place, it is harder to pattern interrupt, right? Because that's
Until
why
the
you
earth
have,
interrupts our pattern for us.
yeah, precisely because you have Jews all over the world living according to rules that made a lot of sense where they were spawned. That doesn't make sense when you're living in New York City or the north of Sweden, but we still do it because we're not linking it to place. So the pattern disrupt isn't there. It does, it makes it more rigid. It makes this thing, okay, here's the 10 commandments, live by them. Um,
I just want to point out briefly there that it's worth looking at the difference between Jewish diaspora culture and Christian colonial culture
yeah,
in terms of what we've talked about already in terms of the difference between the Hebrew alphabet and the Greek alphabet,
yeah.
and that they're actually, because also the Jews have always been a people without a homeland, whereas the Christians just come and they're like, oh, thanks, this will
This
be
is
our home,
us.
like,
Yeah,
and so,
yeah,
so
yeah,
they're occupying two very different social positions wherever they go, and interestingly enough, they have these literary differences at the base of
same,
their culture, at least on a religious and in
yeah,
terms of the people of the book, etc. But so not to detract from what you're saying, but I think that's an important distinction
yeah,
in terms of how this different forms of the Bible have traveled
yeah.
and how those cultures have,
And how the one really is used in a
yeah,
much more weaponized way
yes, yes.
than the other. Absolutely. But kind of setting that aside, the importance of place um, has been, it's like I keep finding new place pops up everywhere. Um,
Yeah. Lately, I've been thinking, what if the most intelligent beings in the world are trees because they are connected to place? The most advanced culture in this planet are the different cultures coming from trees, coming from place, and reading sweet sweet grass and now the one straw revolution talking about agriculture and the non uh, doing nothing um, philosophy and things like that. It really points me out to yeah, being open to learn from them and see and those relationships, not just from one tree, but the relationship between the trees and
yeah.
how yeah.
Yeah, and Jung Porte speaks about kinship.
Yep.
And Robert Wall Kimmerer in her On Being speaks
Yeah.
about,
Kinship.
don't call things an it, say
Yeah.
key
Hmm.
instead, building on the same thing. It's like, because if we are kin,
Yeah.
I will treat you differently. I will think about you differently. I will hold you differently. And kin can be a lot more than, my kids, which incidentally starts with key.
Yeah, I think about the way trees are in relationship with the earth through the depth of and breadth of their roots. Right, that there's when you see a tree,
Mhm,
you're only seeing half of that being, if half of its physical structure. Uh, and then,
mhm,
like you're saying, like what we as humans have to learn from trees who don't have the choice to move. which we do.
Hmm.
And there seemed to be an
Exactly.
interesting parallel there too in terms of the skull brain versus the brain. In
Yeah.
that, right, that the skull brain is not rooted in the body, but the brain is, the nervous system is rooted throughout the body, like the roots of a tree. And it's interesting because Stephen Herod Buhner talks about in Plant Intelligence in the Imaginal Realm, he talks about sentience a lot in terms of everything from trees to
Mm.
single cell organisms, right? And the way it goes into great detail with citations from scientific papers, like just like demonstrating that each of these things are sentient by our broad definition of it, and that, but that with trees, people assume the trees don't have a brain,
Mm.
right? Because of course everything is got to be just like us to be meaningful, right? And so, but it's an entirely different structure. It's not even in the same kingdom of life as we divide it up in binomial nomenclatures in the plant kingdom as opposed to the animal kingdom. And we're trying to hold it to this structure of, well, it can't be intelligent because it doesn't have a brain. Well, it's not even an animal. Like, can we look at it on its terms instead of ours, perhaps? And so one of the things he points out is trees don't need a skull because half of their structure is contained in the earth. It's like a skull protects the soft tissue of the brain, right? Well, a tree doesn't need that. It's got it's in the earth, and so there's this entire core. He's referring to the root system as a cortical structure, as a nervous structure, essentially as the the equivalent of the brain, of the skull brain for a tree. But of course, that system is also distributed throughout the above ground
Yeah.
portion of the tree as well, just as our nervous system is distributed throughout our entire physical forms. And the notion of like sophistication of neural networks and information passing back and forth, like, and we
Yeah.
can talk about the relationship with fungi and other things beneath the surface and how sophisticated and complex a network that is. And then we talk about how sophisticated the human brain is. Well, it maybe starts to pale in comparison, in certain
Yeah.
ways.
And our internet has, yeah, so our technology has got it this far, but they they are telepathic from all around the world. They can communicate with every tree in the world, right? We got it that far yet.
Yeah. Still using training wheels.
Yeah, exactly. And Helena and myself, we talk a lot about limits and boundaries and things like that. And what if the boundary of being in a place, the no mobility boundary, is it has been for their evolution a key, fundamental key to get to that intelligence, to tap to that intelligence and develop it with everything else that they are in relation with the air, with the soil, with the fungi, with everything else. Being in a way that life itself depends on that relationship.
A useful constraint.
Yeah. For everyone
Yeah.
in the planet.
Yeah. I mean, go ahead.
No,
Mhm.
go ahead.
Well, it makes me think of something else Buhner talks about in that same book where the way trees create rain, the way forests create rain, right? And so um, through transpiration, and it's a complex process, of course, but that there is this, um, talk about having something to learn from somebody. I mean, uh, uh, that's something that we we never even considered that possibility
Yeah,
because
we
we're not in
hate
a
we hate
relationship with the
ourselves
place.
sweating,
Right, right, right.
right?
Well, and we don't think that when we cut down a forest, we lose the rain. Like, we don't see the connection because we're not in relationship with either in any meaningful way. We're just trying to, like, stay out of the rain and, all that. So it's not even just, what the trees have to teach us. One thing trees have to teach us is relationship. with fungi, with each other underground, how they communicate, how they negotiate, all these things cooperate, and also with relationship with the atmosphere and with the cycle, which because that is the cycle, right? Transpiration is cyclical. Um, that's why they make the rain to bring the water down, that then the water can come back up, right? And
Mm. I was in therapy today, and we were speaking about breath and heartbeat and whatnot, and Dominic was saying that, if our skin was transparent and like everything was, if we were see through, it would be like impossible not to see how, as above, so below, that type of where, like, shit, we're an intricate system. It's like, and everything works together. And I'm just thinking, it's the same thing. We don't see the tree because it's not see. We don't see, these. I, I have a master's in biology, and I didn't take that much of the green stuff, but enough, plant physiology, these fantastic cells on the underside of the leaves that open up. I don't know what they're called in
stomata, is it?
stomata. Yeah, precisely. That open up. They look like a vagina. They
Mm-hmm.
look like a yoni when they open up, um, and release vapor and it's like
Patterns.
pattern. Yes. And how, again, how blinding it is to kind of rely on sight or touch, rather than can we use all of our senses? Can we, you know, start to be in kinship with the tree? Then we would kind of figure out that, yeah, something is happening here. And yeah, it might be a, you know, valid pattern interrupt. Like she points to in braiding sweetgrass. Sweetgrass grows best if somebody comes and harvests half of it because that's the pattern disrupt they need to have room to live, right? So it's not, you cannot ever bring down a tree. It's like, but we need to do it in kinship. What happens if it is done in kinship rather than I'm here and you're over there and I need you? It's like kind of in that blind way, or not like stepping out of the relationship.
Yeah.
That
No,
is there. It is there. It cannot not be there. It is there.
yeah, it happens. What it happens is responsibility. We don't want that.
No.
Well, it
And
also
I'm
makes
I'm a- and I'm also a wholeness optimistic, but in the sense, today I was speaking with Meg, and she said, yeah, the awakens are having a hard time living, and I said, yeah, I don't want to be part of the awaken. So I am hopeful and optimistic, even, or I have hope because I see both realities.
Mm.
I'm aware enough, and I'm a very little aware, but I'm aware enough to see how we are becoming plastic uh, through our body, and also I'm aware enough to see and to be related with trees in another way, and to see people who are related with nature in another way, and to see how that is becoming more and more also.
synesthesia is coming up for me in terms of this stuff because and I think it maybe ties a few things together, is relationship with place and uh, the role of sensory perception. And
So what does synesthesia mean?
synesthesia is generally referred to as it's when the senses get mixed up or blended, right? So it happens to a lot of people when they're using hallucinogenic drugs, or can happen. What's interesting is that it seems as though really it's actually a natural phenomenon that we've gotten away from. And because David Abram talks about it in terms of relationship with an animate world and an oral culture, Stephen Herod Buhner talks about it in terms of holistic living systems and nonlinear dynamics. And for example, and I'm thinking about it in terms of being in relationship with the world, with a living world, and in a with the intention of taking responsibility, basically. So I want to make the world a better place, but I know that's not just up to me. Like I need to receive instruction. I need to know what the world wants me to do. And don't mean the people world, the human world. I mean like the living world. What my job is as a part of the living world. Um, and how do I do that? How do I find out what the world has to tell me? Like I can't read that in a book, right? I mean, and so how do I go about doing that? And so, but Buhner talks about, he uses the example of juggling as a example of I don't know if he refers to it as a living system, a self-organizing system, but a system is created when a juggler succeeds in keeping all the balls in the air. Um, and and what happens then is this. Um, the perceptual reality of that is you can't think your way into juggling, right? You can't, this is not a linear, like, okay, like keep track of which ball comes next, like the blue ball and the red ball, my right hand, my left hand, like all those balls are going to be on the ground long ago, right? Like you just can't do it that way. Just like Wynton Marsalis can't improvise a solo while he's thinking about scales, right? Like he would never have gotten a recording contract. He's beyond that, And so, but what Buhner points to is that when this is happening, when you've got 3 balls in the air, or 5 balls in the air, or 3 chainsaws and a bowling pin, or whatever it is, that you've had to surrender to something larger than your prefrontal cortex tracking everything, right?
Right.
This is a nonlinear thing that you're now a part of.
Mhm.
Right, and you maybe play a central role, like you're the one with the hands or whatever, um, but that you're not driving it, like that you're responding now, and he describes that as a synesthetic experience, is because what's happening is there's this holistic felt perception is how you're navigating that successfully. That's nonlinear. That's synesthetic. It doesn't. You're taking in this whole sophisticated also talking about sensory gating, so that your sensory gating mechanisms begin to open up, which is also what happens to people on hallucinogens. It's why it's like, oh my God, I see patterns everywhere, or you're overwhelmed, you can't drive when you're on acid, or whatever, you shouldn't. But that even though, this actually Albert Hoffman had to ride the bicycle home because the company car wasn't available on the world's very first human trip on LSD. But uh, point being, though, that in terms of taking responsibility, being in relationship in a responsible way with the living world, um, this is a skill to cultivate. This is a way of being in the world. This is a perceptual skill to cultivate that is part and parcel of being in an oral culture in relationship with the living world that we have lost, or that each of us were born into a world that had left that behind. And so now this is something we have to, I don't know what the right word is, reclaim, find again, develop for ourselves. But it's about receiving instruction. And I think that the body is the key to that, like the dropping out of cognitive awareness into perceptual awareness. Buhner talks about analogical thinking, which sounds suspiciously like abductive process when he describes it, but that's beyond my ken. But anyway, I just think that's an interesting there's something useful there for me
Yeah.
in terms of
Yeah.
understanding this.
And I'm glad you refers to responsibility in that way, because I really don't want to be misunderstood when I speak about responsibility, but the responsibility that is, the flagellation
Yeah.
of the skin, because I have seen. It's not that I'm not talking about that responsibility at all. It's the capacity, the limitless capacity of responding.
Yeah.
Precisely. Well said. And Tyson speaks about how, like, he knew some Danish Vikings now that go to Brazil to get into,
Finfair?
yeah, I don't know. He doesn't mention who and that point, but goes to other cultures, goes to other people to get to the processes because the artifacts remains. These are the 10 gods, and here's a sword, and you have Yggdrasil and Valhalla and all of that. But what's the processes? And not what's our processes? Because they're gone. But what are a process that would allow me to open up, be in communion with, talk to, relate to, be kinship with, and like, so the processes are kind of the life force of all of this. The other stuff is the artifacts. It's like that's what happened, but without the life force of it, they wouldn't be. It didn't start. Here's the 5 gods. It was the life force of it is what spawned these 5 gods.
It's the process of learning to see the moon without the finger.
Yeah.
Mm. Mm.
And it's he has a good way of, I don't remember his exact phrase, but he talks about how they're not I mean, he doesn't even use the word appropriation, I don't think, but he's saying they're not exporting the culture of these people they visit. They're learning what it's for. They're learning what their own artifacts are for and how to use them in their own way. So there is this fundamental principle, essentially, as
Yeah.
opposed to anything on the surface.
Yeah.
I think of it as like seeking to create the conditions for an appropriate culture to emerge, like a responsible culture, a culture that is appropriately responsive to the world as it is in this moment, that can change as it needs to change as the conditions change, and thus the response must as well. But it's that way of learning not to rely on the finger
Mhm.
pointing at the moon, but instead to learn to be in relationship, to develop one's own ability to see them without that point.
You know what, guys? This is our 5th conversation.
Mhm. Yeah.
I'm so lucky though, because I know that we will be continuing to talk because we do, and we did before, and we will.
It has been a pleasure.
Yeah, it really has been to have a dedicated space for the conversation that emerges between us three, because we have a lot of overlap in other spaces and also a lot of that doesn't overlap.
Yeah.
Mm.
So there's something in particular that happens in this conversation that's been really wonderful to have a place to explore that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And as you've seen, I will make sure that we can find 1 time or 2 times where we get together with the other people from season 2 and just share a little bit of that, what has happened, what's it felt like,
Mm.
what's popping.
There's
Because It
Yeah.
was such a treat to do that with the first season. And like you say, Matthew, like something else happens. And when you put somebody else in the conversation, and still there it actually was kind of sitting around a campfire where there's something that we do share that is kind of the starting point for a conversation. Mm. So yeah.
Yeah. I also wanted to say thank you, Helena, for open this space to me, to us, because it's rippling to ways that you cannot imagine. So yeah, it's
Yeah,
like,
and
yeah, thank you.
I'd like to echo that because um, I'm exceedingly grateful for this opportunity to. This is something new for me to do this in a public way. That's what's new about it. Because of course we've had conversations for some time now, but um, because that is also something that brings. That's also in the room with us. Essentially, that's like a party to the conversation. Is the fact that it's not private, that it will be shared, and it brings in a different perspective for me on what it is I'm saying, what it is I'm hearing. Um, that is not, it's something new. It's not present in a private conversation. And it's also for me a part of the process of becoming visible in the world. That is on one level, just in terms of like my name is on a podcast episode description somewhere on the internet, that kind of visible, but also just in terms of my own sense of self in relationship with other. This is separate and not separate from that other process. And so it's been a really significant uh, sort of moment in,
Mm.
in that process for me. That's it's a really significant contribution, which is sort of maybe similar to what Inma, you're saying in terms of ripples,
Yeah.
because there's that as well. Yeah, I'm very, very grateful to you both.
Yeah. It's like my grandma giving me the box of chocolates, making sure that everyone else in the room got a chocolate.
Yeah. Yeah.
And as
That's
you've brought
how.
us back to where we started today so elegantly, I want to add as a attributive footnote that I was puzzling over where I had come across gift culture as a phrase because I knew it was recent. And at first I thought you had said it when you told your story, and maybe you did, but since you commented on it, maybe you didn't. But I did realize that I heard that just last night in a comment from Steve Emery. So to give credit where credit's due, I was only repeating that phrase, but I do like it as well.
Yeah.
Culture versus economy.
Yeah. Lovely. Well, it is now raining. The trees have done their job. And I have choir practice in half an hour, which I'm looking forward to.
Enjoy.
So, yeah, I will enjoy. And thank you.
Mm.
Both.
See you soon.
Yes.
See you
I look
soon.
forward to the next conversation in whatever context that
Yep.
occurs.
Yeah.
It won't be long. That's the only thing I know. It won't be long.
Perfect.